The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her scope for the third time that hour. Her position on the rocky outcrop gave her a clear view of the valley below, where somewhere in the maze of caves and stone formations, a team of Navy SEALs was conducting a critical rescue mission. The intel had been solid. 3 American contractors were being held in a compound deep within Taliban-controlled territory, and time was running out. Maria had been deployed as Overwatch for countless operations, but something felt different about this one. The radio chatter had been minimal, and the usual confidence in the voices of the SEAL team leader, Commander Jake Morrison, seemed strained. She knew Jake from previous missions, a decorated veteran with 15 years of service, known for his calm demeanor under pressure and his ability to get his team home safely. If he was concerned, there was good reason to be. The mission had started before dawn. Maria had taken her position 3 hours before the SEALs moved in, carefully camouflaging herself among the rocks and sparse vegetation. Her Barrett M82 rifle was positioned perfectly, with clear sight lines to multiple approach routes. She was part of a larger support network, but her role was crucial. She was the eyes and ears for the team below, and if things went sideways, she would be their guardian angel. Through her scope, she watched the SEALs move with practiced precision through the valley. 6 operators in total, each one a specialist in their field. There was Jake leading from the front, his movements confident despite the hostile terrain. Behind him, Petty Officer First Class David Chun, their communications specialist, maintained constant but quiet radio contact with command. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez carried the team's heavy weapons, his muscular frame barely slowed by the additional equipment. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class Tyler Williams, moved with the careful awareness of someone who knew he might need to save lives before the day was over. Bringing up the rear were Petty Officers James Butler and Kevin O'Brien, both expert marksmen who could provide covering fire if the team needed to extract quickly. Maria had worked with some of these men before, and she knew their capabilities. But intelligence reports suggested they were walking into something bigger than anticipated. The Taliban presence in this region had been growing, and recent drone surveillance had shown increased activity around the target compound. What was supposed to be a quick in-and-out rescue was starting to look like something much more dangerous. The rescue target was a compound built into the side of a mountain, accessible only through a narrow valley that could easily become a kill zone if enemy forces controlled the high ground. The 3 contractors, engineers who had been working on a civilian infrastructure project, had been missing for 6 days. Each day that passed reduced the chances they were still alive, but intelligence suggested the Taliban planned to move them to a more secure location within hours. As Maria monitored the team's progress, she noticed movement on the ridgelines surrounding the valley. At first, it was subtle, shadows that seemed to shift slightly, or the glint of metal that caught the morning sun for just a moment. Her years of training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she had was now screaming that something was wrong. She keyed her radio, speaking in the calm, measured tone that had earned her respect among the special operations community. Overwatch to Ranger 6. I'm seeing possible movement on ridgelines to your north and east. Recommend heightened awareness. Jake's voice crackled back through her earpiece. Copy, Overwatch. We're seeing it too. Continuing to target. Maria knew that Jake and his team had no choice but to continue. The contractors' lives hung in the balance, and turning back now would likely mean condemning them to death. But as she continued to observe the surrounding terrain, the movement became more obvious. The Taliban forces weren't trying very hard to hide, which meant either they were poorly trained or they were confident enough in their numbers that concealment wasn't a priority. Through her scope, Maria began counting enemy positions. What she saw made her blood run cold. There weren't just a few Taliban fighters scattered around the ridgelines. There were dozens of them, positioned in a carefully planned ambush formation. The SEALs were walking into a trap that had been months in the making. The compound itself sat at the end of the valley like a fortress, its stone walls built into the natural rock formations. It would be difficult to assault under the best circumstances, but with enemy forces controlling the high ground on all sides, it was becoming a suicide mission. Maria realized that the Taliban had likely been using the contractors as bait, hoping to lure American Special Forces into exactly this situation. She quickly began calculating distances and wind conditions, preparing for what she knew was coming. Her position gave her good fields of fire towards several of the enemy positions, but she was only one person with one rifle. Against the number she was seeing, she would need to be perfect with every shot. The SEALs reached the outer perimeter of the compound without incident, moving through the sparse cover with the fluid grace of highly trained professionals. Maria watched Jake signal his team to positions around the main building, preparing for the breach that would either save 3 American lives or cost 9 more. Through her earpiece, she heard the final preparations. "Overwatch, we're going in. Keep eyes on our 6. Roger, Ranger 6. I got you covered." But as the words left her mouth, Maria saw the first muzzle flashes from the ridgelines. The Taliban had waited until the SEALs were committed to the assault, trapped in the open ground around the compound with nowhere to go. The trap was springing exactly as planned. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed through the valley as enemy fighters opened up from multiple positions simultaneously. Maria could see the SEALs diving for cover behind rocks and low walls, but the cover was minimal and the enemy fire was accurate. She watched Jake's team spread out, trying to find defensible positions while maintaining their mission focus. "Contact! Contact!" David Chin's voice cut through the radio static. "We're taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Estimate at least 40 enemy fighters on the ridgelines." Maria was already in motion, tracking her first target through the scope. A Taliban fighter with an RPG launcher was setting up position on the northern ridgeline, clearly preparing to target the SEALs' covered positions. She controlled her breathing, calculated the wind drift, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett's massive .50 caliber round covered the 800 yards to target in just over a second. Through her scope, Maria watched the enemy fighter spin and fall, the RPG launcher clattering down the rocky slope. She was already moving to acquire her next target before the first one hit the ground. But for every enemy fighter she eliminated, there seemed to be 2 more taking shots at the trapped SEAL team. The Taliban had planned this ambush carefully, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. They had turned the valley into a killing field, and the SEALs were caught in the center of it. Maria could hear the increasing urgency in the radio communications. Tyler Williams was calling for immediate medical evacuation. Someone was hit. Mike Rodriguez was coordinating defensive fire, trying to suppress the enemy positions long enough for the team to maneuver. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in terrain that favored the defenders. Through her scope, Maria continued to engage targets, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. But she was fighting a losing battle. There were simply too many enemy fighters positioned too well for one sniper to make a decisive difference. The SEALs needed support, and they needed it fast. The rescue mission was turning into a nightmare, and Maria realized that she might be watching some of the best soldiers she had ever known fight their last battle. The Taliban ambush had been perfectly executed, and unless something changed dramatically in the next few minutes, 6 Navy SEALs and 3 American contractors were going to die in this remote Afghan valley. As enemy fire intensified and the SEAL team situation became increasingly desperate, Maria Santos found herself facing the greatest challenge of her military career. She was no longer just providing overwatch for a rescue mission. She had become the last line of defense for men who had trusted her with their lives. The sound of Jake Morrison's labored breathing crackled through Maria's earpiece as she watched him drag hospital corpsman Tyler Williams behind a boulder barely large enough to provide cover for one person. Blood stained Tyler's left shoulder, and even from her elevated position 800 yards away, Maria could see that the medic was struggling to treat his own wound while simultaneously trying to reach Petty Officer Butler, who had taken shrapnel to the leg and was pinned down behind an inadequate stone wall. The Taliban fighters had revealed the full scope of their ambush now. What Maria had initially counted as 40 fighters was closer to 60, positioned in a horseshoe formation that surrounded the compound on 3 sides. The 4th side, the direction the SEALs had approached from, was blocked by a sheer cliff face that made retreat impossible. The enemy had spent months preparing this trap, and it was working exactly as planned. Maria shifted her position slightly, trying to get a better angle on a group of fighters who were advancing down the eastern ridge. These weren't the poorly trained militants that American forces often encountered in rural Afghanistan. These fighters moved with discipline and coordination, using proper fire and movement techniques as they closed in on the SEAL team's positions. Someone with military training was commanding this operation. Through her scope, She identified what appeared to be the enemy commander, an older man with a gray beard who was directing fighters from a position on the northern ridge. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, and Maria noticed that the other fighters consistently looked to him for direction. Taking him out might disrupt their coordination, but he was well protected behind a rock formation and only occasionally exposed himself enough for a shot. The immediate priority was the advancing fighters on the eastern ridge. They had moved to within 300 yards of the SEALs' positions and were setting up what looked like a heavy machine gun. If they got that weapon operational, it would have direct fire into every piece of cover the SEAL team was using. Maria tracked the machine gun team through her scope, waiting for the perfect moment. The Barrett M82 was designed for this kind of work, long-range precision fires against high-value targets. She had trained with this rifle for thousands of hours, and it had become an extension of her own body. The weapon's massive .50 caliber rounds could punch through light armor and concrete, making them devastatingly effective against human targets at any range. The machine gun team was almost ready to fire. Maria could see them adjusting the weapon's position, preparing to open up on the trapped SEALs. She controlled her breathing, let her heartbeat slow, and found that perfect moment between heartbeats when her body was completely still. The trigger broke cleanly under her finger. The heavy round struck the machine gunner's center mass, the massive kinetic energy lifting him off his feet and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. His assistant gunner looked up in shock, trying to figure out where the shot had come from, and Maria's second round took him down before he could identify her position. But eliminating the machine gun team had revealed her location to other enemy fighters. Almost immediately, AK-47 rounds began impacting the rocks around her position, forcing her to move. The Taliban fighters couldn't accurately engage her at this range with their assault rifles, but they could make her position untenable with sustained fire. Maria low-crawled 20 yards to an alternate firing position she had identified during her initial reconnaissance. The movement took her away from the heaviest enemy fire, but it also limited her fields of fire towards some of the SEAL team's positions. She was facing the classic sniper's dilemma: stay in one position and risk being overrun, or move frequently and reduce effectiveness. From her new position, she could see that the SEAL situation was deteriorating rapidly. Jake Morrison was trying to coordinate with air support, but the nearest Apache helicopters were 40 minutes away, and the SEAL team didn't have 40 minutes. Enemy fighters were advancing from multiple directions, and the team's ammunition was running low after 15 minutes of intense combat. Maria keyed her radio. Ranger 6, this is Overwatch. I count approximately 50 remaining enemy fighters, advancing from your north and east. You need to move to the compound. It's your only defensible position. Jake's response was strained but determined. Copy, Overwatch. We're going to bound by teams. Rodriguez and O'Brien will lay down suppressive fire while we move the wounded. Maria watched the SEALs prepare for what might be their final movement. Tyler Williams was still treating his own shoulder wound, but he was mobile. Butler was worse off. The shrapnel had hit an artery, and he was losing blood fast. David Chun had taken over primary medical duties while maintaining communications, but they needed to get Butler to real medical care soon, or he would bleed out. The first team movement began with Rodriguez and O'Brien laying down accurate rifle fire toward the advancing Taliban positions. Their M4 carbines weren't as long-ranged as Maria's Barrett, but they were effective at keeping enemy heads down while Jake, Chun, and Williams carried Butler toward the compound entrance. Maria provided overwatch for the movement, engaging any enemy fighter who tried to get a clear shot at the moving SEALs. Her position allowed her to see threats that the team couldn't, and she was able to eliminate 3 fighters who had flanked around to firing positions that would have caught the SEALs in the open. The second movement was more dangerous. Rodriguez and O'Brien had to cross open ground with no covering fire except what Maria could provide. Taliban fighters on the western ridge had finally gotten into position where they could engage her location, forcing her to keep moving while trying to provide accurate supporting fire. As O'Brien sprinted across the open ground, Maria saw a Taliban fighter with an RPG launcher rise from behind a boulder on the northern ridge. The range was over 900 yards, at the extreme limit of her effective engagement distance. Wind conditions were variable, and she would have to account for significant bullet drop at that range. She made the calculations instinctively, based on years of training and experience. The Taliban fighter was shouldering the RPG launcher, preparing to fire at the running SEAL. Maria's shot would have to be perfect. There wouldn't be time for a second chance. The Barrett's muzzle brake channeled the blast of the massive round, and Maria immediately began tracking the bullet's flight through her scope. 930 yards away, the Taliban fighter jerked backward as the .50 caliber round struck him in the chest. The RPG round fired wildly into the sky before exploding harmlessly against the valley wall. But the shot had given away Maria's new position, and enemy fire began converging on her location with renewed intensity. She was forced to move again, this time to a position with much more limited visibility. The Taliban forces were learning to coordinate their fire, and they were making it increasingly difficult for her to operate effectively. The SEALs had reached the compound, but their situation hadn't improved much. The stone building provided better protection than the scattered rocks they had been using for cover, but they were still surrounded and outnumbered. Worse, the Taliban fighters were now moving to positions where they could fire directly into the compound through windows and doorways. Maria could see that the enemy commander was repositioning his forces for a final assault. The Taliban fighters were moving with purpose and discipline, setting up overlapping fields of fire and preparing to overwhelm the SEAL team's defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The rescue mission had become a siege, and the defenders were running out of time and ammunition. Through her earpiece, Maria could hear Jake Morrison's radio calls becoming more urgent. Any station, this is Ranger 6. We are in immediate need of close air support and medical evacuation. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition. The response from command was not encouraging. Ranger 6, be advised that air support is still 30 minutes out. Medevac is standing by, but cannot approach until the landing zone is secure. Maria realized that 30 minutes might as well be 30 hours. The Taliban forces would overrun the compound long before help arrived. She was the only thing standing between the SEAL team and complete annihilation, and she was fighting a battle she couldn't win with conventional tactics. As she watched the enemy fighters prepare for their final assault, Maria Santos began to formulate a desperate plan. It would require her to abandon her overwatch position and move much closer to the enemy, close enough that the distinction between sniper and assault trooper would disappear entirely. It was dangerous beyond measure, but it might be the only way to save the lives of 6 Navy SEALs and 3 American contractors. The Taliban commander raised his hand, preparing to signal the final assault. Maria had seconds to make her decision: stay in her relatively safe position and watch good men die, or risk everything on a plan that had little chance of success but might give the SEAL team the time they needed to survive until help arrived. She looked through her scope one more time at Jake Morrison's position. The SEAL commander was preparing his men for the final fight, checking weapons and redistributing ammunition. These were men who had dedicated their lives to protecting others, and now they needed someone to protect them. Maria Santos made her choice. Maria Santos began her descent from the rocky outcrop with the calculated precision of someone who knew that every movement could be her last. She left behind her carefully constructed hide site, abandoning the camouflage position that had taken hours to prepare. The Barrett M82 remained slung across her back, 28 pounds of precision engineering that would be unwieldy for the close-quarters fighting she was about to initiate, but she couldn't afford to leave it behind. Her sidearm, a Glock 19, rode in a tactical holster on her thigh, and she carried 6 additional magazines for the Barrett along with extra ammunition for the pistol. The plan forming in her mind was simple in concept, but nearly impossible to execute. She would move to within effective range of the Taliban commander's position, eliminate him and his immediate staff, then create enough chaos and confusion to disrupt the coordinated assault on the SEAL team. It meant abandoning every principle of sniper employment she had ever learned. Snipers were supposed to remain hidden, engage from long range, and avoid close contact with enemy forces. What she was about to attempt violated all of those rules. As she moved down the mountainside, Maria could hear the increasing intensity of fire around the compound. The Taliban fighters were probing the SEAL team's defenses, testing their ammunition supplies, and looking for weak points in their perimeter. Through her earpiece, she could hear David Chin's voice providing situation reports to command. Ranger 6 to any station. We are surrounded by approximately 50 enemy fighters. We have secured the target building, but have not yet located the hostages. Butler is losing blood fast and needs immediate medical attention. We are down to less than 30% ammunition. The radio crackled back with an update that chilled Maria's blood. Ranger 6, be advised that enemy reinforcements have been observed moving toward your location. Estimate an additional 20 to 30 fighters approaching from the south. Air support is still 25 minutes out. Maria realized that her desperate plan might be the only thing standing between the SEAL team and complete annihilation. The Taliban forces were about to double in size, making any conventional defense impossible. She had to move fast. The terrain worked in her favor as she descended toward the enemy positions. The same rocky formations and sparse vegetation that had provided concealment for the Taliban fighters now concealed her movement. She moved with the careful silence of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible, placing each footstep carefully to avoid dislodging loose stones that might give away her position. As she got closer to the enemy lines, Maria could see the Taliban fighters more clearly. They were well-armed and well-equipped, carrying modern assault rifles, RPG launchers, and what appeared to be at least one heavy machine gun. Their uniforms and equipment suggested they were not local militia, but trained fighters, possibly 4 volunteers or Pakistani military advisors operating across the border. The enemy commander was positioned exactly where she had observed him from her overwatch position, behind a rock formation on the northern ridge that gave him a clear view of the compound, while providing excellent protection from return fire. He was surrounded by what appeared to be his staff, junior commanders, a radio operator, and several bodyguards. Taking out this group would decapitate the enemy command structure, but it would also require Maria to get within 200 yards of approximately 15 armed fighters. She found a position behind a boulder cluster that gave her a clear field of fire toward the command group. At this range, the Barrett would be devastating. The massive .50 caliber rounds would punch through any cover the Taliban fighters were using and eliminate multiple targets with each shot. But firing would immediately reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the valley, and she would have seconds to eliminate as many targets as possible before the return fire became overwhelming. Maria settled into a hasty firing position, using the natural rock formation to steady her rifle. Through the scope, she could see the Taliban commander clearly, an older man with graying hair who was pointing toward the compound and giving orders to his subordinates. She could see his radio operator, a young fighter who was maintaining communications with other Taliban units. 2 bodyguards flanked the commander, their weapons ready, but their attention focused on the compound rather than the surrounding terrain. The range was 180 yards, close enough that the Barrett's massive rounds would be devastatingly effective, but also close enough that the muzzle blast would be clearly visible to every enemy fighter in the area. She would have perhaps 30 seconds of surprise before the Taliban forces could coordinate a response to her attack. Maria controlled her breathing and began her engagement sequence. The first target was the radio operator. Cutting enemy communications would prevent them from coordinating their response to her attack. The second target would be the commander himself, followed by his bodyguards, and any other high-value targets she could identify in the brief window before she had to move. She squeezed the trigger, and the Barrett's massive report echoed through the valley like thunder. Through the scope, she watched the radio operator disappear in a spray of blood and stone chips as the .50 caliber round struck him center mass. She was already working the bolt action and acquiring her second target before the first man hit the ground. The Taliban commander looked up in shock, trying to identify where the shot had come from. Maria's second round took him in the chest, the massive kinetic energy lifting him off his feet and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. His death was immediately apparent to the other fighters, who began shouting and pointing in multiple directions, trying to locate the sniper who had just decapitated their command structure. Maria's third and fourth shots eliminated the 2 bodyguards before they could organize a response. Her fifth shot destroyed a heavy machine gun that had been positioned to fire into the compound. By the time she fired her 6th shot, Taliban fighters throughout the valley were beginning to understand what was happening, and AK-47 rounds were starting to impact the rocks around her position. She abandoned her firing position and began moving immediately, knowing that staying in one location for more than a few seconds would be fatal. The Taliban fighters were converging on her last known position, but They were doing so without coordination or leadership. The death of their commander had created exactly the chaos she had hoped for. Instead of maintaining their disciplined assault on the compound, they were now focused on finding and eliminating the sniper who had devastated their command structure. As Maria moved through the rocky terrain, she could hear the change in radio communications from the SEAL team. Jake Morrison's voice carried a note of surprised relief. Overwatch, this is Ranger 6. We're seeing significant disruption in enemy fire patterns. What's your status? Maria keyed her radio while continuing to move. Ranger 6, I've eliminated enemy command element and am continuing to engage targets of opportunity. Enemy forces are disorganized, but still dangerous. How's Butler? Butler's stable, but needs medevac soon. We've located the hostages. All 3 are alive, but in poor condition. Can you continue to provide support? Maria looked around at her tactical situation. She was now in the middle of approximately 40 Taliban fighters who were actively searching for her. She had limited ammunition and no escape route. But the SEAL team was still alive, the hostages had been found, and air support was less than 20 minutes away. Affirm, Ranger 6. I'll keep them busy. What followed was unlike anything Maria had ever experienced in her military career. She became a ghost moving through the enemy positions, appearing long enough to eliminate a target or 2 before disappearing again into the rocky terrain. The Taliban fighters knew she was there, but they couldn't pin down her location long enough to bring effective fire to bear. She eliminated 2 fighters who were trying to set up an RPG position overlooking the compound. She destroyed another heavy weapon that could have threatened the eventual helicopter landing zone. Each engagement was brief and devastating, but it also forced her to move constantly to avoid being surrounded and overwhelmed. The Barrett's ammunition was running low. She was down her last 3 rounds for the heavy rifle, but the psychological effect of her attacks was far greater than the physical damage she was inflicting. The Taliban fighters had gone from a coordinated assault force to a disorganized group of individuals looking over their shoulders and jumping at shadows. Through her earpiece, Maria could hear the most welcome sound of her military career, the distinctive whop-whop-whop of approaching Apache helicopters. Air support was finally arriving, and with it, the firepower needed to turn the tide of this battle decisively in favor of the American forces. But Maria's position was becoming untenable. She had been moving and fighting for nearly an hour, and the enemy forces were beginning to adapt to her tactics. They were moving in larger groups, providing mutual security and systematically searching the areas where she might be hiding. It would only be a matter of time before they cornered her. She fired her last Barrett round at a group of fighters who were advancing on the compound, then switched to her sidearm. The Glock 19 was effective at close range, but it wouldn't penetrate the cover that the heavier rifle could destroy. She was transitioning from sniper to guerrilla fighter, using mobility and surprise as her primary weapons. As the first Apache helicopter crested the ridge and began engaging Taliban positions with its 30mm cannon, Maria Santos realized that she had accomplished something extraordinary. 6 Navy SEALs and 3 American contractors were going to go home alive. The cost had been high. She was now trapped in enemy territory with limited ammunition and no clear escape route, but the mission was going to succeed. The real question was whether she would survive to see it. The Apache helicopters transformed the battlefield in seconds. Maria watched from her concealed position behind a cluster of boulders as the lead aircraft's 30mm chain gun raked across the Taliban positions on the eastern ridge. The devastating firepower of the attack helicopters was unlike anything the enemy fighters had faced, and their disciplined formations began to collapse under the relentless aerial assault. But Maria's relief was tempered by her immediate tactical situation. In the chaos of her running battle with the Taliban forces, she had been pushed deeper into enemy territory, away from the compound where the SEAL team was holding their defensive positions. Between her current location and friendly forces lay approximately 20 Taliban fighters who were now caught between the Apache helicopters above and her position among the rocks. Her ammunition situation was critical. The Barrett was empty, and she had fired half of her Glock's magazine during her movement between positions. She had 2 spare magazines for the pistol, giving her perhaps 30 rounds total, enough for a brief firefight, but not enough for a sustained engagement against multiple opponents. Through her earpiece, She could hear the coordination between Jake Morrison and the Apache crews as they worked to establish a secure landing zone for the incoming medevac helicopter. Butler's condition was deteriorating despite Tyler Williams' best efforts to stabilize him, and the 3 rescued contractors were in desperate need of medical attention after 6 days of captivity. Apache 6-4, this is Ranger 6. We need you to clear the southern approach to the compound. That's our designated LZ from medevac. Roger, Ranger 6. We're seeing multiple enemy positions on the southern ridge. Beginning engagement now. Maria watched the second Apache helicopter swing around to engage the Taliban positions that threatened the landing zone. The 30mm cannon fire was precisely targeted, eliminating enemy fighting positions with devastating efficiency. But the helicopter crews couldn't see all of the threats. Several Taliban fighters had taken cover in positions that were masked from aerial observation, but clearly visible from Maria's ground-level position. She keyed her radio, speaking quickly as she watched 3 enemy fighters moving toward a position where they could engage the incoming medevac helicopter with RPG fire. Apache 6-4, this is Overwatch. You have 3 enemy personnel with RPGs moving into position at grid reference. She quickly provided the coordinates, using the military grid system she had memorized during her initial reconnaissance. Roger, Overwatch. We don't have visual on those positions. Can you mark the target? Maria realized that the Apache crews needed her to provide target designation, but doing so would reveal her position to every enemy fighter in the area. She looked at the advancing Taliban fighters with their RPG launchers and made the only choice she could. The lives of the aircrew and the success of the medevac operation were more important than her own safety. She rose from her concealed position and engaged the 3 fighters with her Glock, firing rapidly and accurately at the 40-yard range. All 3 went down under her precise fire, but her position was now compromised. Taliban fighters throughout the immediate area began converging on her location, and she was forced to move again. Apache 6-4, targets eliminated. Continue your approach. The medevac helicopter, a UH-60 Black Hawk configured for medical evacuation, appeared over the ridge just as Maria was bounding between rock formations under increasingly heavy enemy fire. The bird settled into the improvised landing zone near the compound, its crew chief and flight medic immediately preparing to receive casualties. Maria watched Tyler Williams and David Shun carry Butler toward the helicopter while Jake Morrison and the rest of the team provided security. The wounded SEAL was unconscious from blood loss, but he was alive. The 3 rescued contractors followed, supported by Kevin O'Brien and James Butler, 3 American civilians who were going home to their families because a SEAL team had been willing to risk everything to save them. But as the medevac helicopter prepared to lift off, Maria found herself in an increasingly desperate situation. The Taliban fighters had identified her general area, and they were conducting a systematic search to locate and eliminate her. She was running low on ammunition, surrounded by hostile forces, and separated from friendly positions by several hundred yards of open ground covered by enemy fire. The lead Apache helicopter had finished its gun run and was circling back for another pass when Maria saw movement that chilled her blood. A large group of Taliban fighters, the reinforcements that command had warned about earlier, was cresting the southern ridge and moving toward the compound. These were fresh fighters, well-armed and organized, and they outnumbered the exhausted SEAL team by at least 3-1. Maria keyed her radio with urgent information. Ranger 6, this is Overwatch. You have approximately 30 enemy reinforcements approaching from the south. They're moving to cut off your extraction route. Jake Morrison's response was immediate and decisive. Roger, Overwatch. We need immediate close air support on the southern approach. All helicopters, we are about to be overrun. The Apache crews responded with professional calm, but Maria could hear the concern in their voices. Ranger 6, we're engaging the southern positions now, but we're running low on ammunition. We could provide maybe 5 more minutes of effective fire support. 5 minutes wasn't going to be enough. The Taliban reinforcements were moving with the discipline and coordination of trained soldiers, using proper fire and movement techniques to advance despite the Apaches covering fire. They would reach the compound before the SEAL team could complete their extraction, trapping the Americans in another siege situation. Maria realized that she was in position to disrupt the enemy advance, but it would require her to abandon any hope of reaching friendly lines. She was positioned on high ground, overlooking the route the Taliban reinforcements were using to approach the compound. With careful fire placement, she could force them to take cover and slow their advance, giving the SEAL team the time they needed to reach their extraction point. But engaging the enemy reinforcements would put her directly in the path of approximately 50 Taliban fighters who were already searching for her. She would be outnumbered 50 to 1, with limited ammunition and no support. It would almost certainly be a suicide mission. Through her earpiece, she could hear the increasing urgency in Jake Morrison's voice as he coordinated the team's movement toward their extraction point. These were men she had worked with, fought alongside, and come to respect as some of the finest soldiers she had ever known. They trusted her to watch their backs, just as she trusted them to complete their missions no matter the cost. Maria checked her ammunition one more time. 15 rounds in her current magazine, 2 full magazines in reserve. Against 50 enemy fighters wouldn't last long, but it might last long enough. She moved to a position that gave her clear fields of fire along the route the Taliban reinforcements were using. From here, she could engage the lead elements and force them to deploy into fighting positions, slowing their advance and giving the Apache helicopters better targets for their remaining ammunition. As she settled into what she knew would be her final firing position, Maria thought about her family back home in Texas. Her parents, who had been so proud when she graduated from Ranger School. Her younger brother, who was serving with the 82nd Airborne. They would understand why she was making this choice. They had raised her to believe that some things were worth fighting for, and some fights were worth dying for. The first Taliban fighters came into view through her scope. Maria took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and prepared to buy Jake Morrison's team the time they needed to get home alive. She squeezed the trigger and began her last stand. Maria's first shots struck the lead elements of the Taliban reinforcements with devastating precision. Her elevated position allowed her to engage targets that were still several hundred yards from the compound, forcing the advancing fighters to take cover and disrupting their coordinated advance. Each round from her Glock was carefully placed. She couldn't afford to waste ammunition with wild shots. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Taliban reinforcements, who had been advancing in loose formation toward the compound, suddenly found themselves under accurate fire from an unexpected direction. Their advance halted as fighters dove for cover behind rocks and sparse vegetation, looking frantically for the source of the incoming fire. Through her earpiece, Maria could hear Jake Morrison coordinating his team's movement toward the extraction point. The brief delay she had created was giving them the precious minutes they needed to reach the landing zone, where additional helicopters were preparing to extract the SEAL team. Ranger 6 to all elements. We are moving to extraction point Bravo. Overwatch, what's your status? Maria kept firing as she responded, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. Ranger 6, I'm engaging enemy reinforcements from elevated position. I could buy you maybe 10 minutes before they reorganize and continue their advance. Roger, Overwatch. Extraction birds are inbound. Can you make it to the alternate LZ? Maria looked at her tactical situation and knew the truth. The alternate landing zone was 800 yards away across open ground that was now swarming with Taliban fighters actively searching for her. Even if she could break contact from her current position, she would never make it to the extraction point alive. Negative, Ranger 6. Just get your team home safe. The silence on the radio told her that Jake Morrison understood exactly what she was saying. Maria Santos was making the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that his team and the rescued contractors could reach safety. It was a decision that no soldier should have to make, but one that defined the very essence of military service, the willingness to give your life so that others might live. Maria continued to engage the Taliban reinforcements with methodical precision. Her position gave her excellent fields of fire, and she was able to eliminate several key targets, what appear to be junior leaders who were trying to reorganize the advance. Each fighter she eliminated further disrupted the enemy's coordination and bought additional time for the American extraction. But her ammunition was running dangerously low. She was down to her final magazine, with perhaps 12 rounds remaining. Against the 50-plus Taliban fighters who were now actively hunting her, it wouldn't last long. She began to conserve her shots, only engaging high-value targets or fighters who posed immediate threats to the extraction operation. The Apache helicopters had expended most of their ammunition and were beginning to withdraw to rearm and refuel. Before leaving, The lead pilot made one final radio call to Maria. Overwatch, this is Apache 6-4. We're Winchester on ammunition and need to RTB. Are you able to reach the extraction point? Maria's response was interrupted by AK-47 rounds impacting the rocks around her position as Taliban fighters closed in from multiple directions. Negative, Apache 6-4. Continue with your mission. Ranger 6, do you have eyes on the extraction birds? Jake Morrison's voice crackled through the static. Affirm, Overwatch. Birds are on final approach. Estimate 3 minutes to wheels up. 3 minutes. Maria looked at the advancing Taliban fighters and calculated that she might be able to hold them for 3 minutes if she was very careful and very lucky. She shifted position one more time, moving to a spot that gave her better protection, but more limited fields of fire. The enemy advance had resumed, but it was more cautious now. The Taliban fighters had learned to respect the accurate fire coming from Maria's position, and they were moving more carefully, using available cover and advancing in small groups rather than as a coordinated unit. This was exactly what Maria had hoped for. By disrupting their initial advance, she had forced them to change tactics in a way that slowed their overall progress. Through her scope, she could see the extraction helicopters landing near the compound. 2 Black Hawks were touching down simultaneously, while a third circled overhead, providing security. The sight filled her with relief. Jake Morrison's team was going to make it home. But her own situation was becoming impossible to sustain. Taliban fighters had worked their way to within 50 yards of her position on 3 sides, and they were beginning to coordinate their final assault. She was surrounded, outgunned, and down to her last few rounds of ammunition. Maria made her final radio call to the SEAL team. Ranger 6, this is Overwatch. I can see your birds on the ground. Get your people loaded and get out of here. Overwatch, we're not leaving without you. We can send a bird to your position. Negative, Ranger 6. My position is compromised and surrounded. Do not risk additional aircraft. Complete your extraction and get home safe. It's been an honor working with you. The emotion in Jake Morrison's voice was clear despite the radio static. The honor has been ours, Overwatch. We won't forget what you've done here today. Maria watched through her scope as the SEAL team and the rescued contractors boarded the waiting helicopters. Tyler Williams was helping load Butler, who was stable but still critical. The 3 contractors were conscious and mobile, walking toward the aircraft under their own power. David Chun was maintaining security while Kevin O'Brien and James Rodriguez conducted a final equipment check before boarding. The last person to board was Jake Morrison himself. The SEAL commander paused at the helicopter door and looked toward the ridgeline where Maria was making her stand. Even at this distance, she could see him raise his hand in a final salute, a gesture of respect from one warrior to another. The helicopters lifted off in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, climbing rapidly to avoid any remaining enemy ground fire. Maria watched them disappear over the southern ridge, carrying 9 Americans who were going home to their families because she had been willing to give everything to ensure their survival. As the sound of the helicopters faded into the distance, Maria found herself alone on a mountainside in Afghanistan, surrounded by Taliban fighters who wanted nothing more than to capture or kill the American sniper who had devastated their forces. She had fired her last round 10 minutes earlier, and her Glock was empty. But she wasn't quite finished fighting. Maria had always carried a fragmentation grenade as a last resort, not for use against the enemy, but to ensure that she would never be taken alive if capture became inevitable. It was a grim calculation that every special operations soldier understood. Some fates were worse than death, and being captured by Taliban fighters was certainly one of them. The enemy fighters were closing in from all sides now, moving with the confidence of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. Maria could hear their voices calling to each other in Pashto as they coordinated their final approach. They knew she was out of ammunition, and they were taking their time to ensure that she had no escape route. But as Maria reached the grenade, she heard a sound that stopped her cold, the distinctive whine of jet engines at high altitude. She looked up to see the contrails of F-16 Fighting Falcons high overhead, and her radio crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. Overwatch, this is Viper Flight. We have been monitoring your frequency and are prepared to provide immediate close air support. Can you mark your position? Maria realized that someone, probably Jake Morrison or the Apache crews, had called for additional air support and provided her coordinates to the incoming fighters. She still had her emergency signaling mirror, a small but highly reflective device designed to mark friendly positions for aircraft. She angled the mirror to catch the afternoon sun and began flashing the standard recognition signal toward the circling aircraft. Within seconds, the lead F-16 pilot confirmed visual contact. Overwatch, I have eyes on your signal. Be advised that we are going to put ordnance danger close to your position. Keep your head down and prepare for immediate extraction. What followed was the most devastating display of precision air power that Maria had ever witnessed. The F-16s made multiple passes, dropping 500-pound bombs with surgical precision on the Taliban positions surrounding her location. The massive explosions shook the entire mountainside, and the surviving enemy fighters scattered in panic. Before the dust had even settled, Maria heard the sound of another helicopter approaching, a Special Operations MH-60 Black Hawk flying low and fast toward her position. The aircraft flared to a hover just long enough for Maria to sprint across the open ground and dive through the open door. As the helicopter banked sharply and accelerated away from the mountains, Maria Santos realized that she was going to survive. The rescue mission had succeeded beyond all expectations. 6 Navy SEALs, 3 American contractors, and 1 very determined sniper were all going home alive. 3 weeks later, Maria found herself standing in a ceremony room at Joint Base Lewis McChord, wearing her dress uniform and trying not to fidget as a general she had never met read from an official citation. The words seemed surreal. Extraordinary heroism, conspicuous gallantry, above and beyond the call of duty. In the audience, she could see Jake Morrison and his team, all of them alive and healthy. Tyler Williams had made a full recovery from his shoulder wound. Butler had spent 2 weeks in a hospital, but was back on full duty. The 3 contractors had returned to their families, forever grateful to the soldiers who had risked everything to bring them home. As the general pinned the silver star on her uniform, the nation's 3rd highest award for valor, Maria thought about the choices that had led her to this moment. She had joined the army to serve her country, but she had discovered something more important in the mountains of Afghanistan. She had learned that sometimes the greatest honor is not in receiving recognition for heroism, but in being willing to sacrifice everything for the people who trust you to watch their backs. The citation ended with words that would follow Maria for the rest of her life. Staff Sergeant Santos' actions reflect the highest traditions of military service and bring great credit upon herself, her unit, and the United States Army. But for Maria, the real victory wasn't the medal or the ceremony. It was the knowledge that 9 Americans who might have died in a remote Afghan valley were instead going home to their families. That was worth any price she might have been asked to pay. As the ceremony concluded and she was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, Maria Santos thought about the words she had spoken to Jake Morrison during the darkest moments of that battle. It's been an honor working with you. The honor, she realized, had been entirely hers.